Welcome to Calm Mysteries, a quiet place where forgotten history, lost kingdoms, and unsolved secrets drift softly through time. There is nothing you need to solve, nothing you need to remember. Just listen, relax, and let the past carry you gently into sleep. The king buried without a name. The limestone cliffs of Dover had watched over England for millions of years, their white faces turned toward the continent like sentries frozen in time. On a bitter morning in early January of 1066, those cliffs witnessed something they had seen countless times before. A funeral procession winding its way toward Westminster Abbey. What made this procession different was not its grandeur or its grief, but the curious silence that surrounded it. The man being carried to his tomb had been King of England for nearly 24 years, yet already his name seemed to be slipping from the tongues of those who had known him best. Edward, called the Confessor by those who revered his piety, had died on the 5th of January, just days after consecrating the great abbey church he had spent decades building. His body, wrapped in precious linens and anointed with oils brought from the Holy Land, rested in a wooden coffin lined with lead. The coffin itself was draped in cloth of gold, and upon it lay the symbols of his kingship: a crown, a scepter, and a sword that he had rarely drawn in anger. Around the bier walked the great men of England, their faces composed in expressions of proper mourning, their minds already racing toward the future. Harold Godwinson walked at the front of the procession, his tall frame wrapped in a cloak of deepest blue. As Earl of Wessex and the most powerful nobleman in the realm, he had every reason to mourn. Edward had been his king, his brother-in-law through marriage to Edith, and in some ways his creation. For it was the Godwin family who had truly ruled England this past years, while Edward devoted himself to prayer and the construction of his abbey. Harold's face betrayed nothing as he walked, but behind his eyes, calculations spun like wheels. Edward had died without an heir of his body, and England needed a king. Behind Harold came his brothers, Gurth, Earl of East Anglia, stocky and reliable, Leofwine, Earl of Kent, younger and still learning the weight of power, and Tostig, who should have been there but was not. Tostig, Earl of Northumbria, had been driven from his lands by rebellion just months before, and now skulked in Flanders, nursing grievances and plotting revenge. His absence from Edward's funeral was noted by all, and the whispers about what it meant travelled up and down the line of mourners like wind through grass. The great earls walked in order of precedence. Edwin of Mercia, young and untested, but bearing an ancient name. Morcar of Northumbria, who had taken Tostig's place and earned Harold's gratitude. Waltheof, son of Siward, who had once ruled the north with an iron hand. They were followed by bishops and abbots, their vestments rich with embroidery, their faces solemn beneath their mitres. Archbishop Stigand of Canterbury led them, though many questioned whether his position was legitimate in the eyes of Rome. He had accepted his pallium from an anti-pope, and the stain of that irregularity clung to him like smoke. The common people of London lined the streets to watch the king pass by one final time. They stood in doorways and leaned from windows, their breath misting in the cold air. Some wept genuine tears for a king they had known all their lives, a king who had been crowned when many of them were children. Others simply came to witness history, understanding that they were living through a moment that would echo down through the years. and some came, because there would be bread and ale distributed after the funeral, and January was a hungry month. Edward had been 62 years old when he died, ancient by the standards of his time. He had lived through more changes than most men could imagine. Born in 1003 or 1005, the records disagreed. He had been the son of Ethelred the Unready and Emma of Normandy. His childhood had been spent in exile, while Danish kings ruled England. Sweyn Forkbeard had driven his family across the Channel when Edward was barely old enough to remember. Then Cnut the Great had consolidated Danish power, marrying Edward's own mother and ruling England as part of a northern empire that stretched from Dublin to Denmark. For 25 years, Edward had lived in Normandy, growing up in the court of his cousin, learning Norman ways and Norman French, while England remained a distant memory coloured by childhood nostalgia. He had learned piety from Norman monks and studied the new architectural styles that were transforming the landscape of Francia. He had made friends among the Norman nobility and had promised, some said, that if he ever became King of England, he would remember those who had sheltered him. It was a promise that would have consequences no one could have predicted. When Edward finally returned to England in 1041, he was more Norman than English. His long exile had made him a stranger in his own land. The language of his childhood had grown rusty from disuse. The customs and concerns of the English nobility were foreign to him. He preferred the company of Norman advisors and filled his court with men who spoke French and looked at England as a rich prize waiting to be properly governed. This had not endeared him to the native English nobility, who saw their influence waning and their ancient customs dismissed as provincial. But Edward had not returned to England through his own power. He had come at the invitation of Harthacnut, the son of Cnut and Emma, who had briefly reunited the English and Danish crowns. Harthacnut had recognized Edward as his heir, bringing him back from exile to wait in the wings. When Harthacnut died suddenly in 1042, some whispered of poison, though he had been drinking heavily at a wedding feast. Edward found himself unexpectedly king at nearly 40 years old. The early years of his reign had been a careful dance between the various factions that could make or break him. The most powerful of these was the Godwin family. Godwin, Earl of Wessex, had risen to power under Nut and had survived every change of regime through a combination of ruthlessness and political acumen. He controlled vast swaths of southern England and commanded the loyalty of armies large enough to threaten any king. Edward had married Godwin's daughter Edith in 1045, a political union designed to bind the new king to the most powerful family in the realm. But it had been a strange marriage from the start. Edward, with his Norman piety and his devotion to the church, had little interest in the physical aspects of matrimony. Edith was beautiful, educated, and politically astute, but she would never bear Edward's children. Whether this was due to Edward's supposed vow of chastity, as later hagiographers would claim, or simply to personal incompatibility, the result was the same. After more than 20 years of marriage, the King and Queen of England had no heir, and the succession hung over the kingdom like a sword suspended by a thread. The Godwin family had dominated Edward's reign, sometimes supporting him, sometimes restraining him, always protecting their own interests. In 1051, Edward had finally tried to break free from their influence. He had exiled the entire Godwin clan, sent Edith to a nunnery, and filled his court with Norman favourites. For a brief moment it seemed he might rule England as he wished, transforming it into something closer to the Norman duchy he remembered from his youth. But the Godwins had returned the following year with an army, and Edward had been forced to take them back, to restore their lands and titles, to recall Edith from her convent. The Norman advisors he had imported were sent packing, fleeing across the Channel with tales of English treachery. From that moment on, Edward had understood that his power had limits, that he ruled at the sufferance of men like Godwin, and, after Godwin's death in 1053, Godwin's ambitious son, Harold. So Edward had turned his attention to matters of the spirit and to his great building project at Westminster. The Abbey church that rose on the marshy ground west of London was unlike anything England had seen before. Built in the new Norman style, with soaring arches and innovative construction techniques, it was Edward's gift to God and his monument to himself. He had poured treasure into its construction, diverting funds that might have gone to maintaining armies or building alliances. The church was his obsession, his consolation, and his legacy. Now, as his body was carried into that same church for burial, the irony was not lost on observers. Edward had lived to see his abbey consecrated, but only barely. He had attended the ceremony on the 28th of December, 1065, already so weak that he had to be supported by attendants. A week later, he was dead, and the building that was meant to celebrate his piety became instead his tomb. The interior of Westminster Abbey was still new enough that the smell of fresh mortar lingered in the air. The stone walls rose in elegant curves, supported by flying buttresses that seemed to defy gravity. Light filtered through windows of coloured glass, casting patterns on the floor that shifted with the movement of the sun. The altar was dressed in white linen, and golden candlesticks reflected the flames of hundreds of candles. Everything spoke of wealth, power, and devotion to God. Edward's coffin was placed before the high altar, while Archbishop Stiggan intoned the prayers for the dead. His voice, trained by decades of liturgical service, filled the vast space with Latin phrases that most of those present did not understand, but recognized as proper and holy. The choir sang responses, their young voices rising toward the vaulted ceiling. Incense smoke curled upward, carrying with it the prayers of the living for the soul of the departed. Harold stood with his head bowed, his mind racing despite the solemnity of the moment. Edward had spoken to him in his final days, that much was certain. The question was, what exactly the dying king had said. Harold would later claim that Edward had designated him as his successor, that with his last breath, the king had placed the kingdom in Harold's hands. Others who had been in that death chamber, the queen, certain bishops, a handful of nobles, would remember things differently, or at least claim to. Memory, Harold was learning, was a political tool, shaped by present needs as much as by past truth. The simple fact was that England needed a king immediately. The realm could not afford a prolonged succession crisis, not with William of Normandy across the Channel making threatening noises about his own claim to the throne, not with Harold Hardrada of Norway eyeing England's wealth from the north, not with Scotland and Wales always ready to take advantage of English weakness. The Witan, the council of great men who advised the king and had the right to elect his successor, would meet as soon as the funeral rites were concluded. They would choose a king, and that king needed to be someone who could command loyalty, raise armies, defend the realm. Harold knew he was that man. He had governed England in all but name for years, while Edward prayed and built churches. He had led armies against the Welsh, bringing them to heel after years of reading. He had managed the complex politics of the earldoms, balancing competing interests and preventing the realm from fracturing into civil war. He was English born and raised, unlike Edward with his Norman upbringing. The nobility knew him, respected him, and in many cases owed their positions to him. But there were complications. William of Normandy claimed that Edward had promised him the throne years before, during the period when Norman advisors had dominated the English court. William also claimed, and this was more dangerous, that Harold himself had sworn an oath to support William's claim to England. The circumstances of this alleged oath were murky. Harold had been shipwrecked on the Norman coast in 1064, ending up as William's reluctant guest. What exactly had transpired during that visit was a matter of fierce dispute. Harold maintained he had been coerced, that any oaths sworn under duress were not binding. William insisted that Harold had freely sworn on holy relics to support Norman succession. Then there was Edgar the Atheling, grandson of Edmund Ironside, the last king of the old English royal line to fight against Nut. Edgar was young, perhaps 14 or 15 years old, and he had royal blood that Harold lacked. The Godwinsons were great nobles, but they were not descended from the ancient line of Wessex kings that stretched back through Alfred the Great to the misty origins of English monarchy. If legitimacy of blood mattered more than capability and power, then Edgar had a claim that trumped Harold's. But Edgar was a boy, and England needed a warrior king. The Witan would understand this. They would choose Harold, and he would deal with the consequences. William could protest all he wanted from Normandy. Harald Hardrada could scheme in his Norwegian hall. They would find that taking England from an anointed king, blessed by archbishop and supported by the full might of the English nobility, was a very different proposition from claiming an empty throne. The funeral mass continued for hours, as was proper for a king. Prayers were offered, psalms were sung, and the biography of Edward's reign was read aloud in Latin and then in English for those who knew no Latin. The account was carefully curated, emphasizing Edward's piety, his building projects, his peaceful reign. It glossed over the years of exile, the political struggles, the dominance of the Godwin family, the lack of an heir. History was being written in real time, and the writers understood that certain truths were better left unspoken. Finally, as the short January day began to fade, Edward's body was lowered into the tomb, prepared for it, in the floor of the abbey. The tomb was positioned in a place of honour, directly in front of the high altar, where every celebration of the Mass would invoke his memory. The stone lid was lowered into place, and masons immediately began the work of sealing it properly. Edward the Confessor, King of England, was buried in the church he had built, surrounded by the symbols of his faith. But even as the masons worked, even as the mourners filed out of the abbey into the gathering darkness, the question hung in the cold air. Who would succeed him? The Witan gathered that very evening, understanding that delay was dangerous. They met in Westminster Palace, in the great hall where Edward had held court, where the architecture was still Norman in its elegance, but the business conducted was purely English. Harold Godwinson stood before them, not as a supplicant, but as a man stating facts. He recounted his years of service to the realm, his military victories, his administrative competence. He mentioned, though not in these exact words, that he had the armies and the loyalty necessary to defend England against all comers. He acknowledged Edgar the Etheling's royal blood, but suggested that the boy needed a few more years before he would be ready for kingship. Perhaps he could serve as Harold's heir, learning the craft of rulership under experienced guidance. The assembled nobles listened, nodded, and came to the conclusion that most of them had reached before the meeting began. England needed Harold, and Harold was ready to be king. The vote, when it came, was as close to unanimous as such things ever were. A few voices spoke for Edgar, but they were half-hearted, understanding that this was not the time for a boy king. Edgar himself, sitting quietly in a corner of the hall, seemed almost relieved not to be chosen. The weight of England was too heavy for shoulders as young as his. On the 6th of January, 1066, the day after Edward's funeral, Harold Godwinson was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey. The speed was unseemly by traditional standards. A proper period of mourning should have been observed, but these were not normal times. Archbishop Stigand performed the ceremony, placing the crown on Harold's head and anointing him with holy oil. Whether Rome would recognize this coronation, given Stigand's questionable status, was a problem for another day. What mattered was that England had a king. As Harold knelt before the altar, feeling the weight of the crown settle onto his brow, he thought about the man whose body lay just feet away, entombed in the stone floor. Edward had ruled for 24 years without producing an heir, and in doing so he had created the crisis that was about to engulf England. Harold felt a flash of anger at the dead king's selfishness, his retreat into piety, while practical matters went unattended. Then he pushed the feeling aside. Edward was gone, and what Edward had done or failed to do was now just history. The future belonged to Harold, but the future had other ideas. Across the channel in Normandy, Duke William received the news of Edward's death and Harold's coronation with cold fury. He had been expecting the English throne, had been promised it by Edward during those years when Norman influence had been strong at the English court. And Harold, that oath-breaker, that perjurer who had sworn on sacred relics to support William's claim, had stolen what was rightfully his. William was many things. He was the illegitimate son of Duke Robert of Normandy, born to a tanner's daughter, a man who had fought his way to power against all odds, but he was not a man who accepted defeat quietly. William began building ships and gathering an army. He sent envoys to the Pope, arguing that Harold was a usurper and an oath-breaker, that the cause of Norman succession was just and holy. Pope Alexander II, persuaded by William's arguments and his promises of reform in the English Church, sent a papal banner to bless the Norman enterprise. What had been a dynastic dispute was now a holy crusade, at least in the eyes of those who chose to see it that way. In Norway, Harald Hardrada, the legendary warrior who had fought from Constantinople to Russia, who had survived the Battle of Stiklestad as a youth, and had carved out a reputation as the last great Viking, also saw opportunity in England's confusion. He had his own claim to the English throne, derived from a complicated agreement between Magnus of Norway and a Harthacnut years before. It was a thin claim, hardly worth mentioning in normal times, but these were not normal times, and Hardrada had something that mattered more than legal arguments. He had warriors and ships, and a lifetime of experience in taking what he wanted. Tostig Godwinson, Harold's exiled brother, appeared at Hardrada's court with promises and proposals. He painted a picture of an England ripe for conquest, divided by Harold's hasty coronation, ready to welcome liberators who would overthrow the usurper. It was mostly fantasy. England was not divided, and Tostig's support in his former earldom of Northumbria was minimal, but Hardrada chose to believe it. Or perhaps he simply chose to take the chance, understanding that even fantasies sometimes come true and that the greatest prize often goes to those willing to take the greatest risks. Harold, newly crowned and not yet secure on his throne, faced enemies on multiple fronts. He spent the spring and summer of 1066 preparing for invasion, not knowing which enemy would strike first or from which direction. He stationed his army along the southern coast, watching for William's invasion fleet. He kept the Fyrd, the militia of free men who owed military service, mobilized far longer than was customary, straining the patience of farmers who needed to return to their fields for harvest. The waiting was its own kind of torture. Every day that passed without invasion was a day of resources spent, of men kept from their work, of tension ratcheted higher. Harold moved constantly between London and the coast, inspecting defences, encouraging troops, watching the channel for the first sign of Norman sails. He was a vigorous man in his mid-40s, energetic and decisive, but even he felt the weight of the waiting. In September, with harvest time approaching, and his army's patience exhausted, Harold made the decision to demobilize the Fyrd. The men returned to their fields, and Harold rode north with his household troops. Word had reached him that Hardrada and Tostig had landed in Yorkshire with a massive Norwegian force. They had defeated the northern earls Edwin and Morcar at the Battle of Fulford on the 20th of September, and now they were camped at Stamford Bridge, distributing the spoils of their victory and awaiting Harold's response. Harold covered the distance from London to Yorkshire with astonishing speed. His forced march would become legendary, covering nearly 200 miles in less than 5 days. He gathered troops as he went, calling on every oath of loyalty, every obligation of service. By the time he reached Stamford Bridge on the 25th of September, he had an army that was tired from marching, but ready to fight for their homes and their king. The Battle of Stamford Bridge was a slaughter. The Norwegians, caught by surprise on a warm September day, many of them without their armour, fought with desperate courage, but were overwhelmed by Harold's fury. Hardrada fell with an arrow in his throat, the last great Viking leader dying in a muddy English field far from home. Tostig died too, killed in the melee, and Harold stood over his brother's body, with emotions too complicated to name. They had been close once, before ambition and jealousy had driven them apart. Harold gave the surviving Norwegians terms they could barely believe. They could go home. Of the 300 ships that had brought Hardrada's army to England, only 24 were needed to carry the survivors back to Norway. Harold watched them sail away, knowing that the Norwegian threat was finished, that no northern power would trouble England again in his lifetime. It was a great victory, perhaps the greatest of his career, but there was no time to savour it. 3 days after Stamford Bridge, word reached Harold that William of Normandy had landed at Pevensey on the southern coast. The invasion Harold had been expecting all summer had finally come, and it had come at the worst possible moment, when his army was exhausted from battle and hundreds of miles from where it needed to be. Harold turned his army south and marched again. Once more his troops covered impossible distances, driven by their king's example. and by the knowledge that their homes and families depended on speed. They reached London on the 6th of October, paused only briefly to gather more men, and then pushed on toward the southern coast, where William was building fortifications and ravaging the countryside around Hastings. The chroniclers would later debate whether Harold should have waited in London, should have given his army time to rest and gather reinforcements. But Harold knew something that the chroniclers, writing safely in monasteries years later, did not know. He knew that every day William remained in England was a day that the Norman Duke grew stronger, that his fortifications became harder to assault, that his reputation as a conqueror who could not be dislodged grew more formidable. Harold had to strike quickly, had to drive William back into the sea before the Norman invasion could put down roots. On the night of the 13th of October, Harold's army camped on a ridge near a place called Senlac Hill, about 7 miles from Hastings. It was good defensive ground, a narrow ridge with steep slopes on either side. Harold had fought enough battles to know that holding high ground against cavalry was crucial. His army was composed primarily of infantry, the huscarls who served as professional warriors in the households of great nobles, and the furred farmers and craftsmen who fought with spears and axes and shields. William's army was different. He had Norman knights on horseback, the finest cavalry in Europe. He had Breton and Flemish mercenaries drawn by promises of English land and wealth. He had archers in numbers that Harold could not match. And he had something else. He had the papal banner flying over his forces, declaring this a holy war sanctioned by God's representative on earth. It was propaganda, but propaganda that had weight, that made men fight with the conviction that heaven itself was watching. The Battle of Hastings began on the morning of the 14th of October, 1066. It lasted all day, from dawn until dusk, one of the longest single-day battles of the medieval period. Wave after wave of Norman cavalry charged up the hill at the English shield wall, only to be thrown back by disciplined ranks of warriors who had fought together at Stamford Bridge just 3 weeks before. Harold's huscarls stood firm, their great two-handed axes cutting through armour and horseflesh with equal effectiveness. But William was cunning as well as brave. When his frontal assaults failed, he ordered his troops to feign retreat, to pull back as if defeated, and lure the English down from their ridge. It was a tactic that required discipline and trust in leadership, because a feigned retreat could easily become a real one. But William's men performed the maneuver perfectly, and some of the English, thinking victory was at hand, broke formation to pursue what they thought was a fleeing enemy. When they reached level ground, the Norman cavalry wheeled and cut them down. Still, the English line held. As the afternoon wore on and casualties mounted on both sides, it seemed possible that Harold might win, that he might do what no one had thought possible and defeat Duke William of Normandy in open battle. The sun was setting, the light was failing, and if Harold's army could hold until nightfall, William would have to retreat. The Norman supply lines were thin, and his men were exhausted. Then an arrow, fired high into the air by a Norman archer, who probably could not even see his target clearly in the gathering gloom, arced over the English shield wall and fell toward earth. It struck Harold in the face, piercing his eye. The King of England, who had marched 300 miles in 3 weeks, who had destroyed the Norwegian invasion and rushed south to defend his realm, who had stood firm all day against the finest army in Europe, fell to a random arrow shot by an unknown archer in the last hour of daylight. When the English saw their king fall, When the word spread through the ranks that Harold was down, the heart went out of their resistance. Some fled immediately. Others, the huscarls who had eaten Harold's bread and sworn to die for him if necessary, formed a ring around his body and fought on until they were all cut down in the darkness. By the time the moon rose over Senlac Hill, the battle was over and England had changed forever. William spent the night on the battlefield, guarding it as the custom of the time demanded. In the morning, he walked among the dead, looking for Harold's body. It was found eventually, identified by certain marks known to Harold's former lover, Edith Swan-Neck, who had been brought to the field for that purpose. The body was mutilated, desecrated by Norman soldiers who had spent the day fighting against this man and who needed to work out their fear and fury on something that could no longer fight back. William of Normandy, now William the Conqueror, though he would not be called that for many years yet, faced a decision about what to do with Harold's body. The proper thing, the chivalrous thing, would have been to allow Harold to be buried with honour, to acknowledge him as a worthy opponent who had died defending his kingdom. But William was trying to establish that Harold had never been the legitimate king at all, that the coronation in January had been illegal, that Harold was an oath-breaker and a usurper whose reign had no validity. Allowing Harold a state funeral in Westminster Abbey, burying him beside Edward the Confessor as if he had been a true king, would undermine William's entire argument. It would acknowledge Harold's kingship in death, even if William denied it in life. So, William refused permission for a proper burial in consecrated ground. Harold's body was taken from the battlefield and, according to some accounts, buried in a rough grave on the beach near Hastings, covered with rocks and forgotten. But other accounts, whispered in corners and repeated in chronicles, written by monks who had no love for Norman rule, told the different story. They said that Edith Swan-Neck had begged William for Harold's body, had offered him Harold's weight in gold if he would only allow proper burial. William had refused, but the abbot of Waltham Abbey, where Harold had been a great benefactor, had secretly obtained the body and buried it on the abbey grounds. The location of the grave was kept secret to prevent William from desecrating it, and only a few trusted monks knew where Harold Godwinson, King of England for 9 months, lay in the earth. For William, the question of what to do with Harold's body was just one small problem among many. He had won the Battle of Hastings, but he had not yet conquered England. The northern earls Edwin and Morcar were still alive, still commanded armies, still held vast territories. Edgar the Etheling was in London with those who had supported his claim to the throne. Archbishop Stigand, whatever his flaws, was still the head of the English Church. London itself was the richest city in the realm, protected by Roman walls and defended by men who had not yet acknowledged William's claim. William moved cautiously at first. He marched his army in a wide arc around London, burning and ravaging as he went, demonstrating what resistance would cost. He seized Dover and its castle, securing his supply lines back to Normandy. He sent messages to the English nobility, offering terms. Accept his kingship and keep your lands and titles. Resist and face destruction. It was a carrot and stick approach, and it worked on enough of the nobility to prevent unified resistance. Edwin and Morcar, who might have formed the core of English resistance, chose instead to submit. They rode south with Edgar the Etheling and met William at Berkhamsted, north of London, in early December. There they acknowledged William as king, trading their independence for the promise that they could keep their earldoms. It was a pragmatic decision, probably the right one given the circumstances, but it doomed any chance of driving the Normans from English soil. On Christmas Day, 1066, less than a year after Edward the Confessor's death, William was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey. Archbishop Steigen was pushed aside, and Archbishop Eldred of York performed the ceremony, giving it a legitimacy that Stiggen's participation could not have provided. The coronation was interrupted by chaos when Norman guards outside the abbey, hearing shouts from inside, thought there was an attack and began setting fire to nearby buildings. The ceremony concluded in confusion and smoke, an ominous beginning for a new reign. William's coronation meant that England now had been ruled by 3 different kings in a single year: Edward, Harold, and William. Chroniclers would call it the Year of 3 Kings, understanding that it marked a turning point in English history. But in the immediate aftermath, it was not clear that William's rule would last. He returned to Normandy in March of 1067, leaving England in the hands of regents, and immediately rebellions broke out. The West Country rose in revolt. The North, which had never really submitted, erupted in violence. Edwin and Morcar, having accepted Norman rule, and then discovering what Norman rule actually meant, changed their minds and joined the resistance. Edgar the Atheling fled to Scotland and began making alliances with England's traditional enemies. Even Edith, Edward the Confessor's widow, who had seemed to make her peace with William, was suspected of supporting the rebels. William returned to England in December of 1067 and spent the next 3 years crushing resistance with systematic brutality. The pattern was always the same. A region would rebel. William would march there with his army. The rebels would either fight and be slaughtered, or flee and watch their lands be devastated. Then William would build a castle, install a Norman lord, and move on to the next rebellion. It was effective but exhausting, and it transformed England into an occupied country, where Norman castles dotted the landscape like occupying fortresses. The worst of it came in the winter of 1069 to 1070, when William conducted what became known as the Harrying of the North. The Northern Rebellion had been particularly stubborn, supported by a Danish invasion fleet that had sailed up the Humber. William drove out the Danes through diplomacy and bribery, paying them to go home. Then he turned his fury on the English population that had supported them. For 3 months, Norman armies swept through Yorkshire and Northumbria, burning villages, destroying crops, killing livestock, and slaughtering anyone who resisted. The goal was not just to punish rebellion, but to make future rebellion impossible by destroying the economic base that could support it. When William's armies were finished, much of northern England was a wasteland. Chroniclers wrote that the destruction was so complete that some areas did not recover for generations, that travellers could ride for days without seeing a living soul or an inhabited village. The Domesday Book, the great survey of England that William would order compiled 20 years later, still showed the scars of the harrying of the North. Entire regions were marked as waste, unable to pay taxes because there was no one left to tax and nothing left to take. The death toll was never recorded precisely, but modern historians estimate that it may have reached 100,000 people, a staggering number representing perhaps 5% of England's total population. It was genocide in all but name, the systematic destruction of a population for political purposes. By 1070, William's conquest was complete. The English nobility had been destroyed, killed in battle, or dispossessed of their lands. Norman lords now held every major title and controlled every castle. The English church had been purged of native leadership and filled with Norman bishops and abbots who owed their positions to William. Even the English language was in retreat, pushed aside by French in the corridors of power, surviving only among peasants, and in remote regions where Norman influence had not yet penetrated completely. And through all of this upheaval and violence, Edward the Confessor lay in his tomb in Westminster Abbey, undisturbed and increasingly forgotten. His reign, which had once seemed so important, was now just a brief interlude between the Danish kings and the Norman conquest. His great abbey church remained standing, but it was filled now with Norman knights and French-speaking bishops who cared nothing for Edward's memory or his English piety. Yet something curious began to happen in the years after the conquest. As the trauma of the Norman invasion faded into memory, as a new generation grew up knowing only Norman rule, people began to look back at Edward's reign with nostalgia. They remembered it as a time of peace, a golden age before the conquest, when England had been ruled by an English king who loved God and built beautiful churches. They forgot or chose to ignore the political machinations, the dominance of the Godwin family, the weakness that had left England vulnerable to invasion. Miracles began to be reported at Edward's tomb. Sick people claimed they were healed after praying there. Pilgrims travelled to Westminster Abbey to seek the dead king's intercession with God. Stories circulated about Edward's prophetic visions, his ability to heal the sick with his touch, his conversations with saints. The man who had been considered a political failure during his lifetime was transformed in death into a holy figure, a saint who embodied English piety and innocence. The process of turning Edward into Saint Edward the Confessor was gradual and politically complex. William and his successors supported it because a saintly Edward who had supposedly designated William as his heir strengthened Norman claims to legitimacy. The English church supported it because it gave them a native saint to rival the Norman and French saints that the new bishops were promoting. Common people supported it because it gave them a connection to the pre-conquest past, a symbol of Englishness that survived despite Norman domination. In 1002, 36 years after Edward's death, his body was examined by a commission appointed by King Henry I, William's youngest son. They reported that the body was uncorrupted, a sure sign of sanctity. The fact that the body had been embalmed and sealed in a lead coffin in a dry tomb was conveniently overlooked. What mattered was that Edward's uncorrupted body was proof of his holiness, and proof was needed because the campaign for his canonization was gathering momentum. Pope Innocent II declared Edward a saint in 1161, nearly a century after his death. It was a political canonization as much as a religious one, supported by the English monarchy, which needed all the legitimacy it could gather, and by an English church eager to assert its independence from excessive Norman influence. Saint Edward the Confessor became the patron saint of England, his feast day celebrated on the 13th of October, the day before the Battle of Hastings, as if his sanctity could somehow redeem the disaster that had followed his death. Edward's tomb in Westminster Abbey became one of the most important pilgrimage sites in England. King Henry III, who ruled in the 13th century, was particularly devoted to Saint Edward and spent enormous sums rebuilding Westminster Abbey in the Gothic style to properly honour his saintly predecessor. Edward's body was moved to a magnificent new shrine behind the high altar encased in gold and jewels, surrounded by space for pilgrims to kneel and pray. The humble tomb had become a spectacle of wealth and devotion. But what of Harold, the king who had actually ruled England in 1066, who had fought and died to defend it, who had been anointed and crowned, and had worn the crown for 9 months? Where was his tomb? The answer was that no one quite knew. If he had been buried at Waltham Abbey, as some claimed, the location had been kept secret and then forgotten. If he had been buried on the beach at Hastings, as others claimed, the grave had long since been washed away by tides or obliterated by storms. Harold became England's king without a tomb, buried without honours, his memory suppressed by the Norman conquerors, who had every interest in pretending he had never been a legitimate king at all. Norman chroniclers portrayed him as an oath-breaker and a usurper, whose death at Hastings was God's judgment on his sins. English chroniclers who might have defended his memory were intimidated into silence or chose to focus on the safer subject of Edward's sanctity. Yet Harold was not entirely forgotten. In corners of England where Norman power did not fully penetrate, in monasteries where monks who remembered the old days still lived, stories about Harold persisted. Some claimed he had not actually died at Hastings, that the body identified by Edith Swanneck was someone else, that Harold had survived his wounds and lived out his days in exile, or as a hermit atoning for his sins. These stories were almost certainly false, the product of wishful thinking and the human need for alternative endings to tragedy, but they demonstrated that Harold's memory refused to die completely. The contrast between Edward's magnificent shrine and Harold's unknown grave became a symbol of how history is written by winners. Edward, who had contributed to England's vulnerability through his lack of an heir and his political weakness, was elevated to sainthood and honoured with one of the finest shrines in Christendom. Harold, who had fought desperately to save England from foreign conquest, was buried in an unmarked grave and written out of official history. The irony was not lost on those who bothered to notice it. Over the centuries, various people tried to discover where Harold was actually buried. In the 16th century, during the dissolution of the monasteries under King Henry VIII, Waltham Abbey was destroyed and its graves were opened. Some claimed that a grave was found that might have been Harold's, identified by fragments of armour or by the length of the body, but nothing was proven, and the remains, if they were Harold's, were scattered or lost. In the 18th and 19th centuries, when antiquarian interest in pre-conquest England revived, several scholars investigated the question of Harold's burial. They examined the contradictory chronicle accounts, searched for physical evidence, and debated the political circumstances that would have influenced where and how Harold was buried. But no consensus emerged. Some were convinced he lay at Waltham, others argued for Bosham in Sussex, where Harold had owned land. Still others thought the original story about burial on the beach at Hastings might be true. The truth is that we do not know where Harold was buried, and unless some remarkable archaeological discovery is made, we probably never will know. He has become one of history's nameless dead, powerful in life but anonymous in death. His tomb, if it exists at all, lies somewhere in England, unmarked and forgotten, while lesser men rest in monuments that proclaim their importance to anyone who cares to look. There is something deeply tragic about this obscurity. Harold was, by any reasonable standard, a great man. He was a skilled military commander who won significant victories against the Welsh and the Norwegians, He was an effective administrator who governed England well during Edward's latter years. He was brave enough to claim a crown and defend it with his life, yet he is remembered, if he is remembered at all, primarily for his failure at Hastings, for being the last English king before the Norman conquest, for being the obstacle that William overcame. Modern historians have tried to rehabilitate Harold's reputation, to acknowledge his achievements and his genuine claim to the throne. They point out that his coronation by the Witan was entirely legal by English standards, that Edward's deathbed designation of Harold as his successor was probably genuine, that William's claim based on Edward's supposed promise years earlier was weak and possibly fabricated. They note that Harold's so-called oath to William was given under duress and would not have been considered binding by the standards of the time. But despite these efforts, Harold remains a secondary figure in the popular imagination, overshadowed by William the Conqueror on one side and St. Edward the Confessor on the other. He is the man in the middle, the last representative of a world that was about to end, defending traditions and institutions that would not survive his death. His story is not one of triumph, but of noble failure, which makes it harder to celebrate, but perhaps more human and more true. The Battle of Hastings itself has been analysed endlessly by military historians. They debate whether Harold should have waited for reinforcements before engaging William, whether his decision to give battle when and where he did was strategically sound or a fatal mistake driven by anger at William's ravaging of the countryside. They study the tactics of the shield wall versus cavalry charges, the role of archers in medieval warfare, the importance of terrain and morale and leadership. What often gets lost in these technical analyses is the simple human reality. Harold was exhausted. He had marched his army from London to Yorkshire, fought a major battle at Stamford Bridge, marched back to London, and then pushed on to Hastings, covering more than 500 miles in 3 weeks. His men were tired. Many of them were still recovering from wounds received in the north. His army had not had time to gather reinforcements from the western and northern regions that remained loyal to him. Harold could have waited. He could have rested in London, gathered a larger force, let William's army weaken itself through disease and supply problems. Every military principle suggested that this would have been the wise course, but Harold chose to attack immediately, and that choice reveals something about his character and his understanding of kingship. He believed that a king had to be seen fighting for his realm, had to demonstrate that he would defend every inch of England personally, had to show that invaders would be met with immediate and furious resistance. It was the warrior's code, the ethic of personal honor and courage, that still dominated medieval thinking, despite the growing sophistication of military strategy. Harold could not bear to let William fortify his position unopposed. He could not tolerate Norman soldiers ravaging English farms while he sat safely in London. His honor, his sense of what a king owed his people, demanded that he fight as soon as possible. And so he marched to Hastings and fought a battle he might have won if fortune had been kinder, if that arrow had not found his eye, if darkness had come an hour earlier. After Harold fell, after William was crowned, after the conquest was complete, England changed in ways that went far beyond simple political control. The entire structure of society was transformed. Norman French became the language of government, law, and culture. English survived but was relegated to the status of a peasant language, considered crude and unsuitable for important business. For 3 centuries, England would be governed in a language that most of its inhabitants did not speak. The English nobility disappeared, replaced by Norman lords who held their lands by military force and governed through castles that dominated the landscape. The architecture of England changed as Norman builders erected churches and castles in the Romanesque and later Gothic styles. The legal system was reorganized along Norman lines. The church was reformed, purged of English traditions that the Normans considered corrupt or primitive. In some ways, the Norman conquest was beneficial. It connected England more closely to continental Europe, exposing it to cultural and intellectual developments that might otherwise have been slow to arrive. It brought administrative innovations that made royal government more effective. It helped create a unified England by destroying the regional power bases that had often fragmented the realm. The question is whether these benefits were worth the cost in blood, suffering, and cultural destruction. The immediate cost was catastrophic. In addition to the tens of thousands who died in the conquest and its aftermath, countless others lost their lands, their status, their livelihoods. English thegns who had held land for generations found themselves dispossessed, reduced to the status of tenants on properties their families had once owned. English bishops and abbots were removed from their positions and replaced by Normans who could barely speak the language of their congregations. An entire cultural and political elite was destroyed in less than a generation. Yet English identity survived, transformed, but not destroyed. In monasteries and village churches, in songs and stories passed down through generations, the memory of pre-conquest England persisted. It became idealized over time, remembered as a golden age that probably never quite existed, but the memory itself was important. It preserved a sense of Englishness that eventually re-emerged and reshaped the Norman-descended aristocracy into something recognizably English again. This process took centuries. The nobility continued to speak French until the 14th century, when the 100 Years' War with France made French seem like the language of the enemy, rather than the language of the ruling class. English gradually reasserted itself in government and culture, though deeply influenced by French vocabulary and grammar. By the time of Geoffrey Chaucer in the late 14th century, English had become a literary language again, capable of expressing sophisticated ideas and emotions. The irony is that modern English, the language that has become the global lingua franca, is a hybrid created by the Norman conquest. It has the basic grammatical structure and core vocabulary of the Germanic language spoken by Harold's warriors, but it has absorbed thousands of French words that came in with William's knights. This linguistic fusion, forced into existence by conquest and occupation, eventually became one of English's great strengths. Its flexibility, its enormous vocabulary, its ability to absorb words from any language it encounters. But to the people living through the conquest, to the farmers and craftsmen and minor nobles whose worlds were torn apart by Norman violence, the long-term linguistic evolution would have been cold comfort. They lived through the immediate catastrophe, the burning villages and slaughtered livestock, and lords who spoke a foreign language and demanded tribute at sword point. They mourned the old world that was passing, and they remembered, with a nostalgia that grew sharper with time, the brief reign of King Harold. Harold's memory persisted in folklore and legend, even when official history tried to erase him. Tales were told of his bravery at Hastings, of how he and his housecarls fought all day against overwhelming odds. Stories circulated about the curse that supposedly fell on William's line because of the conquest, the strange deaths and family conflicts that plagued Norman and Plantagenet kings. Some saw Harold as a martyr who had died defending England from foreign invaders, a heroic if tragic figure. In the 19th century, when nationalism swept through Europe and people began to value their ethnic and cultural identities more explicitly, Harold experienced something of a rehabilitation. Victorian historians, uncomfortable with the idea that England had been conquered and occupied, preferred to emphasize the continuity of English institutions and the ways in which Norman rule had been gradually Anglicized. Harold became a symbol of English resistance to foreign domination, celebrated for fighting to preserve English independence, even though he ultimately failed. This romanticized version of Harold ignored many complications. It overlooked the fact that his own family, the Godwinsons, had Danish ancestry and had risen to power serving Danish kings. It simplified the complex political situation of 1066, making it seem like a straightforward contest between English and Norman, when in reality it involved competing claims to succession, broken oaths, and the ambitions of multiple rulers. It turned Harold into a nationalist hero, fighting for an English nation that would not exist in the modern sense for many centuries. But myths and symbols do not have to be historically precise to be culturally powerful. Harold as the defender of England against foreign conquest, Harold as the last English king who stood his ground and died rather than submit, Harold as the brave warrior betrayed by bad luck. These images resonated with people who wanted to believe that English identity was worth fighting for, worth dying for. The fact that the real Harold was more complicated, more politically calculating, more flawed, did not diminish the power of the symbol. Westminster Abbey, where both Edward and Harold's successor William were buried with full honours, became a kind of museum of English monarchy. Every king and queen from William the Conqueror forward was crowned there. Many were buried there, their tombs growing more elaborate as centuries passed. The abbey was expanded and rebuilt multiple times, each generation adding to its glory. It became one of the most important buildings in England, a physical embodiment of royal continuity and national identity. But Harold had no place in this monument to English monarchy. There was no tomb, no memorial, no acknowledgement that he had ever worn the crown. Official history, as represented by the Abbey's collection of royal tombs, jumped directly from Edward the Confessor to William the Conqueror, as if the 9 months between them had never happened or did not matter. It was an erasure so complete that visitors to the Abbey could remain completely unaware that England had ever had a King Harold. This changed slightly in the 19th century, when a small memorial to Harold was finally added to the Abbey. It was not a tomb, no one knew where his body was, but simply a stone marker acknowledging his reign and his death at Hastings. It was placed not in the main part of the church where the royal tomb stood, but in a side chapel, in a location that made clear Harold's ambiguous status. The memorial was better than nothing, but it highlighted rather than resolved the question of how history should remember him. In recent decades, as archaeology and historical research have refined our understanding of the Norman conquest, there has been increased sympathy for Harold and recognition of his achievements. Historians note that he was dealt an impossible hand, a kingdom without a clear line of succession, multiple foreign claimants backed by powerful armies, a nobility fractured by regional interests, and enemies on every border. That he held England together as long as he did, that he defeated one invasion before losing to another, that he made William fight for every inch of ground. These accomplishments deserve recognition, even though they ended in failure. The question of where Harold is buried remains unanswered. Periodic attempts to locate his grave using modern archaeological techniques have yielded no definitive results. Waltham Abbey, the most likely site according to medieval sources, was so thoroughly destroyed in the 16th century that finding a specific grave from the 11th century would be nearly impossible, even if we knew exactly where to look. The beach at Hastings, if that was indeed his burial site, has changed dramatically over 900 years of coastal erosion and development. Perhaps the mystery is fitting. Harold represents a world that was destroyed, a path England might have taken but did not. His unknown grave symbolizes all the lost possibilities, all the histories that might have been written if that arrow had flown a few inches differently. We cannot know what England would have become if Harold had won at Hastings, if the Norman conquest had been repelled, if English rather than Norman institutions had shaped the following centuries. But we can know that it would have been fundamentally different, that the England we inhabit now is the England created by William's victory and Harold's defeat. The battle itself, despite its decisive outcome, was closer than many accounts suggest. The English shield wall held for hours against cavalry charges that would have broken lesser formations. The Normans were forced to resort to elaborate tactics, feigned retreats, combined arms assaults, to create the openings they needed. Until that arrow struck Harold, the battle could have gone either way. Victory and defeat hung on contingencies so small that they almost disappear into chance. The trajectory of an arrow fired blindly into the air, the stamina of men who had already fought one battle and marched hundreds of miles. If Harold had won, if William had been killed or forced to retreat to his ships, the subsequent history would have been radically different. There would have been no Norman aristocracy dominating England, no French linguistic influence, no continental connections that would eventually lead to English claims on French territory in the 100 Years' War. England might have remained more Scandinavian in character, more connected to the North Sea world than to continental Europe. The culture, the language, the political institutions, everything would have evolved differently. But Harold lost, and that loss determined the future. The Norman conquest was the last successful invasion of England, the last time foreign conquerors fundamentally reshaped English society. After 1066, England would fight off other invasions, the Spanish Armada, Napoleon, Hitler, but would never again fall to foreign conquest. This fact has shaped English and later British identity profoundly, creating a sense of island invulnerability that has both positive and negative aspects. The memory of the conquest itself, of the catastrophe that befell England in 1066, remained alive in English consciousness for centuries. It became a reference point, a warning about what happens when kingdoms are unprepared, when succession is unclear, when enemies are underestimated. Medieval chroniclers repeatedly drew lessons from the conquest, using it to illustrate moral and political points. And at the center of that catastrophe stood Harold, the king who tried and failed to prevent it. In some chronicle accounts, Harold is portrayed almost sympathetically despite the Norman bias of most post-conquest chroniclers. They acknowledge his bravery, his military skill, his desperate attempt to save his kingdom, they note that he died in battle, the death of a warrior king, rather than fleeing or surrendering. Even writers who considered him an usurper and an oath-breaker had to admit he had fought courageously at the end. Modern archaeology has added physical evidence to the written chronicles. The battlefield at Hastings has been studied intensively, revealing details about how the battle was fought and where different phases occurred. Human remains found on what is believed to be the battlefield show the terrible injuries inflicted by medieval weapons, skulls split by swords, bones shattered by axes, bodies pierced by arrows. These anonymous dead might include Harold himself, though there is no way to know for certain. The fate of Harold's family provides a coda to his story. His mother Githa fled to Exeter and then to Flanders when resistance collapsed. His surviving brothers were killed fighting the Normans. His children, by Edith Swanneck, disappeared from history, probably dying young or living in obscure exile. The Godwinson dynasty, which had dominated England for a generation, was utterly destroyed within a year of Harold's death. Their lands were distributed to Norman knights, their wealth was confiscated, their names were erased from positions of power. Only Edith, Edward the Confessor's widow and Harold's sister, managed to make her peace with William and retain some wealth and status. She lived quietly in Winchester, the ancient capital of Wessex, neither supporting resistance nor openly collaborating with the conquerors. When she died in 1075, she was buried in Westminster Abbey, not far from her husband Edward. At her funeral, some must have remembered her brothers and thought about how completely the world had changed in less than a decade. That change, brutal and comprehensive, touched every level of society. At the top, an entire aristocratic class was replaced. In the middle, the church was reorganized and filled with foreign clergy. At the bottom, common people found themselves subject to harsher laws and heavier taxes as the Normans built their castles and established their control. The forest laws that William imposed, reserving vast areas for royal hunting and punishing even minor violations with mutilation or death, became symbols of Norman oppression. Yet over generations, Norman and English began to blend. Norman lords married English heiresses to gain legitimacy and local support. The children of these marriages spoke both French and English, drawing on both traditions. The Norman Church incorporated some English saints and practices alongside continental reforms. Slowly, very slowly, a new English identity began to emerge, neither purely Anglo-Saxon nor purely Norman, but something hybrid and new. This process was neither smooth nor inevitable. Rebellions continued for decades after the initial conquest. The last significant English resistance was not crushed until the surrender of Hereward the Wake in the marshes of Ely in 1071. Even after organized resistance ended, smaller acts of defiance continued. Norman lords were murdered, castles were burned, tax collectors were attacked. The occupation was contested every step of the way. William himself never fully trusted his English subjects and never became truly English, despite ruling England for 21 years. He spent much of his time in Normandy, governing England through regents and visits rather than continuous residence. He built castles throughout the kingdom, not just to protect against external enemies, but to control the internal population. The Tower of London, his greatest fortress, was positioned to dominate London itself, showing clearly that he saw the English as potential enemies who needed to be kept under military control. When William died in 1087, he was succeeded by his son William Rufus, who was killed in a hunting accident in the New Forest in 1100. The circumstances were suspicious enough that some suspected murder, and popular opinion held that his death was God's judgment for the destruction of English villages to create the royal hunting preserve. His brother Henry I then seized the throne, ruling with a combination of Norman efficiency and tactical concessions to English sensibilities. Henry married Edith, daughter of Malcolm III of Scotland and St. Margaret, who was herself descended from the Old English royal line. Edith was the great-granddaughter of Edmund Ironside, which meant her children would have both Norman and English royal blood. She took the Norman name Matilda after marriage, but everyone knew her ancestry, and her marriage to Henry was celebrated by the English as a symbol that the two peoples might eventually unite. Their children, including the future Empress Matilda, represented a new synthesis of Norman and English. By the 12th century, 3 generations after the conquest, the distinction between Norman and English was beginning to blur. The grandchildren of William's knights considered themselves English, spoke English alongside French, and resented being governed by kings whose primary interests lay in Normandy or other continental possessions. When King John lost Normandy to France in 1204, the final link was cut, and the Anglo-Norman nobility became simply English, their French ancestry an increasingly distant memory. Through all these transformations, Harold's tomb remained unknown and his memory ambiguous. He could not be openly celebrated because that would implicitly criticize the Norman conquest and question the legitimacy of the ruling dynasty. But he could not be completely forgotten either, because he represented something important. The last moment when England had been ruled by an English king, answerable to English traditions. That memory, suppressed but persistent, waited for moments when it could safely re-emerge. Those moments came during periods of conflict with France, when English kings wanted to emphasize their Englishness rather than their French heritage. They came during periods of political reform, when critics of royal power looked back to pre-conquest England as a golden age of freedom and proper governance. They came in literature and popular culture, in ballads and stories that kept alive the memory of Harold's stand at Hastings. The king buried without a name was never entirely forgotten, even when official history tried to erase him. In the end, perhaps the absence of Harold's tomb is more eloquent than any monument could be. It speaks to the completeness of the Norman conquest, to how thoroughly William and his successors tried to obliterate the legitimacy of Harold's reign. It speaks to the fragility of power and memory, to how quickly a king can pass from the throne to oblivion, and it speaks, paradoxically, to the resilience of memory, to the fact that despite everything, we still remember Harold, still debate his decisions, still wonder where he lies and what England lost when he fell. The white cliffs of Dover, which watched Edward's funeral procession in January of 1066, watched William's invasion fleet arrive in September of the same year. They have stood unchanged through all the transformations that followed, the destruction and the rebuilding, the forgetting and the remembering, the successive waves of history that have washed over England. They will stand long after our current civilization has become as mysterious to future generations as Harold's world is to us. And somewhere, in some unmarked grave that might be anywhere in England or nowhere we can find, Harold Godwinson rests, the king buried without a name, the last echo of a world that ended at Hastings on an autumn afternoon 960 years ago.